Welcome to episode 12, part 4 of the Diplomacy and Discourse channel. This installment continues our multi-part series on power politics. But here, we take a sharp turn. If the earlier episodes walked us through the architecture of empires, alliances, and ideological competition, this one plunges us into the murky endgames and long-term echoes of those choices. We begin to unpack the subtle calculations that shape not only how great powers act, but how they remember their actions. From Biden's efforts to manage escalation in Ukraine without triggering World War III to Trump's transactional view of global leadership, this episode explores the logic of strategic restraint and the price of misreading history. In a world where restraint can look like weakness and consistency can be confused with inflexibility, the new rules of power politics are still being written, in real time, and often without consensus. We are diving deep into the quieter parts of the story, the off-ramps, the red lines, the ambiguous intentions, and the growing gaps between rhetoric and reality. The way policymakers interpret the war in Ukraine will shape not just how this conflict ends, but how future ones might begin. This is the essence of power politics, how today's decisions ripple outward, creating echoes in the strategies of tomorrow. A unified international response to Ukraine wasn't just about managing that war. It was about signaling how the world will respond to similar acts of aggression in the future. When countries act together, they can do more than deter escalation. They can define the terms of global order moving forward. Joint action opens the door to diplomacy, reinforces the norms of sovereignty, and makes space for negotiated outcomes. It also ensures that the interests of smaller or vulnerable nations aren't lost in the shuffle, and that diplomacy isn't something selectively applied. It becomes a standard expectation. But how this war is remembered matters. If US or European policymakers come to see the Ukraine response as a vindication of existing strategies, military aid, economic sanctions, cautious escalation, they may replicate that model in future conflicts without properly adjusting for different regional dynamics. That's the danger of misreading endgames, treating a temporary resolution as a permanent formula. A common front in Ukraine may have helped deter wider war, but the effectiveness of that unity must be critically evaluated before it's projected onto other theaters like Taiwan or the South China Sea. At the same time, it has helped reinforce the US image as a consistent, if not always agile, partner. That perception of reliability builds diplomatic capital and can reduce the likelihood of future miscalculations by adversaries who may have doubted Washington's willingness to act. As the geopolitical competition with China and Russia deepens, the long-term impact of how Ukraine was handled could echo far beyond Eastern Europe. Some foreign policy scholars have credited former President Joe Biden with navigating the Ukraine conflict with a steady hand. Throughout his term, Biden affirmed Ukraine's sovereignty and supported robust sanctions on Russia. He committed to military aid and worked to sustain diplomatic engagement. But while these moves were eventually firm, the administration's early-stage response was marked by hesitation. The US didn't initially grasp the full scale of Russia's intent or the urgency of the situation in late 2021. That miscalculation left Washington playing catch-up in early 2022, scrambling to get ahead of a rapidly unfolding crisis. This delayed urgency affected the initial perception of US leadership, raising questions about whether the US could still lead in moments of rapid geopolitical transformation. Despite these early missteps, critics who opposed Biden on other fronts still acknowledged how he managed to avoid a worst-case scenario in Ukraine. They pointed to his expertise with Russia, his measured tone, and his trust in diplomatic channels. Biden's team reportedly worked behind the scenes, coordinating closely with allies and intelligence services, and carefully calibrating each step to avoid an uncontrolled spiral. His ability to listen to seasoned advisors and communicate with European partners helped keep the coalition together. Rather than leaning on unilateralism, Biden favored a more distributed model of leadership, relying on NATO, the EU, and G7 nations to shoulder both the risk and responsibility. Throughout the crisis, the administration made a conscious effort to keep lines of communication with Moscow open. Biden and his senior officials maintained contact with Russian counterparts, not to concede, but to clarify red lines and minimize the risk of miscalculation. This was textbook power politics, but applied with restraint. The goal wasn't to provoke Russia further, but to box it in, diplomatically and economically, while leaving off-ramps open. At the same time, the administration doubled down on its support for Ukraine. Weapons, intelligence, and logistical backing flowed in steadily, aimed at improving Kiev's self-defense capabilities without drawing NATO into direct confrontation. Critics continued to flag the administration's initial slowness in recognizing the seriousness of the situation. But ironically, those same early warnings helped the administration build internal consensus. When the conflict did explode into full-scale war, the White House already had plans on the table, ready to activate aid, sanctions, and alliance coordination almost immediately. All of these decisions, the early hesitation, the later firmness, the diplomatic balancing, now form the closing chapters of Biden's foreign policy legacy. But they also set the tone for what comes next. How the Ukraine conflict ends, and how it's remembered, will shape the next phase of U.S. foreign policy and global security norms. That's what makes it an endgame and an echo at the same time. The lessons pulled from Ukraine won't stay in Ukraine. They'll shape Washington's posture toward Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, and beyond. And they'll influence how allies assess the value of sticking together in future crisis or going it alone. The more dangerous outcome that former President Joe Biden's approach aimed to avoid wasn't just a prolonged ground war between Russia and Ukraine. It was the possibility of a far wider regional or even global conflict spiraling out of control. A direct military confrontation involving two militarily capable nations with nuclear powers and NATO alliances looming in the background risked igniting a chain reaction that no side could fully control. Biden's restrained strategy was designed to contain the conflict within Ukraine's borders and avoid dragging the West into a new kind of 21st century war. In that sense, his focus wasn't just on immediate crisis management, but on avoiding an endgame scenario that would have irreversible consequences. Yet, the caution that helped prevent escalation also created long echoes, one that still reverberate in today's perceptions of U.S. credibility and leadership. During the first year of the Biden administration, little was said publicly about the strategic framework surrounding Ukraine. While the U.S. consistently affirmed Ukraine's sovereignty, it failed to articulate what that support would look like if tested. There was no clear public roadmap, no stated thresholds for action, and few signals that preparations were underway for the possibility of a Russian invasion. This ambiguity projected uncertainty, not just to Ukraine, but to allies and adversaries alike. Without details, the declarations of support sounded hollow. The result was that the U.S. committed to Ukraine's independence was doubted in key circles, and Washington's deterrence posture appeared tentative. These were not just rhetorical missteps. They were signals that shaped the decisions of others, including Vladimir Putin. By February 2022, the administration had clarified its position. The United States would not directly engage militarily in Ukraine. Instead, it would act through sanctions, arms transfers, and intelligence sharing. On paper, this was the right choice, measured, clear, and aligned with long-term strategic caution. But it also revealed something else. There had been little groundwork laid for this policy in the months prior. There was no comprehensive strategy articulated to the public or allies. No clearly defined goals or limits. The lack of early clarity meant the pivot to this new approach felt improvised, not proactive. This absence of planning opened the door for miscalculation, both in Moscow and among U.S. partners, who were left wondering how far Washington was willing to go and what its ultimate objectives were. That uncertainty had its own costs. New reports later revealed that weeks before the full-scale invasion, Biden had already concluded that direct confrontation with Russia would be both strategically ineffective and economically burdensome. That decision was rooted in realism, but even as the administration made that call, it still moved ahead with plans to arm Ukraine, despite its internal belief that Ukraine might lose. That disconnect between expectations and actions hints at a deeper failure, a lack of a broader strategic imagination. The administration appeared reluctant to explore the other diplomatic alternatives, such as publicly proposing a temporary moratorium on Ukraine's NATO ascension to de-escalate tensions. While there's no guarantee such a gesture would have succeeded, the unwillingness to consider it suggests a rigidity in approach that proved costly. This was a moment where the U.S. could have tested creative diplomacy, but instead defaulted to reactive containment. This failure to develop a robust, multi-dimensional strategy left Washington flat-footed when the invasion finally began. Aid was rushed, messaging had to be recalibrated, allies had to be re-engaged, and all of this happened in the glare of a global spotlight. The U.S. did rise to the moment in terms of material support, but the delay in doing so became part of the narrative. That narrative didn't just affect Ukraine, it shaped how adversaries perceived American resolve, and how allies calculated their dependence on U.S. leadership. These are the echoes that now follow this conflict into its next phase. The inability to deter Russia before the invasion, combined with the ad hoc response afterwards, has raised larger questions about the United States' role in maintaining international security. Within Europe, it deepened some existing divides. Certain European countries took a far more aggressive stance against Moscow, while others hesitated or remained neutral. The absence of a unified US-led diplomatic and strategic front not only complicated the Western response, it weakened the image of American leadership just when it was needed most. In a world where global influence is increasingly contested, and where countries are watching closely to see how the US responds to threats, that credibility matters. The power politics of the future are being shaped not just by what Washington does, but by how consistently and credibly it does it. President Donald Trump's second term signals a reassertion of his trademark foreign policy doctrine: transactional, unilateral, and unapologetically nationalist. But beneath the surface of headline deals and policy reveals lies a deeper story about how power politics is being reshaped in real time. These aren't just new policies. They are the echoes of a different worldview, one that challenges the traditional architecture of U.S. global leadership and suggests a new kind of endgame, one where national interest trumps collective action, and economic leverage replaces alliance building as the principal tool of influence. In the Middle East, Trump's decision to lift sanctions on Syria after the rise of President Ahmad el-Sharaa marked a departure from past U.S. policy. It was not just a tactical shift. It was a signal that American engagement in the region would now be driven less by human rights concerns and more by economic opportunity and realpolitik. This choice revealed how the end of one conflict, Syria's long civil war, could be recast as a new opening for American investment and influence, even at the cost of legitimizing a regime with a brutal past. The echo of this approach is clear. Diplomacy is now a tool for transactional reinvention, not just a conflict resolution. Trump's recalibration of the Iran strategy follows a similar logic. Abandoning the previous administration's emphasis on maximum pressure, he floated the possibility of a new nuclear deal, but on the condition that Iran dismantle its regional proxy networks and freeze its nuclear ambitions. This wasn't an olive branch. It was a calculated opening. Trump's interest in renegotiation was rooted in leverage, not reconciliation. And while critics accuse him of undermining long-standing multilateral efforts, supporters pointed to a pragmatic shift: offer a path forward only when it can be shaped entirely on America's terms. In this version of power politics, strength lies not in coalitions, but in conditional engagement. The end of isolation became an opportunity to reimagine dominance, not cooperation. In Ukraine, Trump's administration steered away from active military involvement, opting instead for diplomatic mediation through surrogates like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was sent to Turkey for talks. This approach reframed American leadership, not as a guarantor of sovereignty, but as a broker of outcomes. The temporary pause in military aid and intelligence sharing wasn't just a cost-saving measure. It was a deliberate attempt to force a recalibration. By pressing Ukraine to negotiate with Russia and asking Europe and Turkey to carry more of the load, Trump presented a new echo of American disengagement. It was a departure from Biden's collective deterrence and a return to selective participation. Here, the endgame wasn't victory. It was equilibrium, even if that meant freezing the conflict rather than resolving it. Domestically, Trump's Executive Order 14169 initiated a 90-day freeze on all foreign development aid, a move framed as a strategic audit. The idea was simple: align every dollar spent abroad with a narrow definition of American self-interest. Humanitarian exceptions were granted, but the core message was unambiguous. Foreign aid would no longer serve abstract ideals or global goodwill. It would serve deals, leverage, and advantage. This wasn't just a bureaucratic review. It was a philosophical break with decades of liberal internationalism. It marked the end of aid as a symbol of soft power and the rise of aid as a bargaining chip. The echoes of this shift would be felt by allies and adversaries alike, particularly those whose stability has long depended on U.S. development programs. Trump's withdrawal from institutions like the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Agreement was less about those organizations themselves and more about reasserting sovereignty as the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. These moves were pitched as corrections to an international system that, in Trump's view, had come to rely too heavily on American generosity without offering proportionate returns. In doing so, he continued to reject the post-World War II consensus that saw multilateralism as a source of stability. The echo here is not just America first, but America alone, a deliberate decoupling from frameworks that had previously restrained unilateral ambition. This strategy reveals a deeper belief that global influence is not built through shared responsibility, but through dominant positioning in one-on-one relationships. Trade was another arena where Trump's approach reasserted itself in familiar form. Tariffs were reinstated on China, Mexico, and Canada, not merely as punitive tools, but as bargaining levers in broader negotiations. These actions were justified by the administration as necessary correctives to what Trump called unfair trade practices, with the goal of reshaping supply chains and reviving domestic manufacturing. While critics warned of the global economic consequences, Trump's base saw a long overdue return to assertive economic nationalism. The long-term echo of this policy isn't just about trade. It's about redefining how economic power can be weaponized in geopolitical contests. For Trump, the endgame isn't interdependence. It's economic insulation coupled with tactical dominance. In the defense sphere, Trump announced a $1 trillion investment initiative which included the rollout of the so-called Golden Dome missile defense system. Modeled loosely on Israel's Iron Dome, this project was pitched as a national shield against evolving threats from China and Russia. The idea wasn't just about deterrence, it was about self-reliance, a vision of military supremacy that functions independent of NATO or international coalitions. This reflects a broader trend in Trump's worldview, the end of reliance on others, and the pursuit of strategic security through overwhelming strength and technological insulation. The echo of this doctrine is clear. American defense must be so advanced that it renders alliance structures optional, not essential. Looking toward the rest of 2025 and beyond, Trump's foreign policy seems set to continue along this path. The foundation has already been laid. Economic nationalism, strategic disengagement from global institutions, bilateral deal-making, and a belief in zero-sum diplomacy. But the echoes will grow louder in the coming years, especially as other global powers respond. Whether the world becomes more stable or more fragmented depends not just on how Trump governs, but on how others choose to react. The endgames of one leader can trigger new openings for others, and the long-term shape of power politics may come down to who learns, who adapts, and who miscalculates. Despite the many factors contributing to the conflict in Ukraine, a deeper issue continues to hover beneath the surface: an unwillingness among U.S. policymakers to fully admit the broader implications of their choices. The refusal to commit militarily to Ukraine is often couched in language about peace, sovereignty, and support for Ukrainian democracy. But behind that, there appears to be a long-standing reluctance to confront what this stance might actually signal: a calculated attempt to weaken Russian influence over Eastern Europe and reshape the regional balance of power without triggering a direct confrontation. In doing so, the U.S. avoids the acknowledgement that its involvement in Ukraine is part of a much older and more deliberate strategy rooted in containment, deterrence, and influence. This unwillingness to be fully transparent is not unique to the current administration. It's an echo of decades of U.S. foreign policy practice. This tendency to obscure long-term strategic aims under the guise of short-term diplomacy didn't begin with President Biden. It was evident during the Bush administration's post-9/11 reorientation toward Eurasian security. It continued under Obama's pivot to multilateralism, often coupled with a quiet reinforcement of NATO's eastern flank. The language may shift, but the method remains. The public rhetoric centers on peacekeeping and international norms, while the actions often reflect great power rivalry and strategic positioning. The Biden administration inherited this playbook, and while it has applied it with its own tone and tools, it has not rewritten the fundamental script. For that reason, it continues to face the same critiques about ambiguity, about inconsistency, and about the gap between stated values and strategic behavior. Still, to fairly assess these patterns, it's necessary to acknowledge the complexity that underlines foreign policy decision-making. Choices about war, peace, and international involvement are not made in a vacuum. They emerge from dense webs of national security interests, diplomatic pressures, historical obligations, and domestic political calculations. The idea that the U.S. would allow Ukraine to bear the brunt of the fighting while stepping back from direct military engagement is not necessarily rooted in malice or indifference. It's a reflection of a larger power calculus, one where influence is measured by leverage, not by sacrifice. To say that the United States wants to weaken Russia might be true in part, but that alone doesn't account for the enormous constraints and risks that shape every move. These are the mechanics of power politics at work, not in headlines, but in long timelines and quiet strategy rooms. For years, one of the cornerstones of U.S. policy in Eastern Europe has been the belief that bringing countries like Georgia and Ukraine into NATO would deter Russian expansion. That belief was hardened by Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 and the subsequent annexation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Those events were seen by U.S. officials as not just a regional power grab, but as a direct test of the West's resolve. In response, American policymakers doubled down on their commitment to Georgia and Ukraine, pushing forward with the narrative that eventual NATO membership was both a right and a necessity. The goal wasn't just to offer protection, it was to draw a new line in the sand, one that signaled to Moscow that the post-Cold War map would not be redrawn without consequences. Yet the very insistence on NATO enlargement, especially in the face of vocal opposition from Russia, has become a self-reinforcing cycle. Each time the US reaffirmed its support for Ukraine's NATO aspirations, Russia responded with more aggression. And with each act of Russian aggression, Washington strengthened its case for NATO expansion. This feedback loop has created a geopolitical environment where every move, even one made in the name of defense, is interpreted by the other side as provocation. The echoes of this logic are everywhere, from missile placements in Poland to intelligence sharing agreements in the Black Sea. The endgame has become paradoxical: prevent war through deterrence, but risk escalation with every step. What is often overlooked is how this cycle mirrors the Cold War itself. Back then, ideological standoff and spheres of influence defined the global order. Today, though the players and technologies have changed, the game looks strikingly familiar. Power is projected through military posturing, alliance building, and economic pressure. Influence is contested in border regions and proxy wars. Public narratives champion freedom and sovereignty, while the underlying competition is about leverage and legacy. Ukraine is not just a conflict. It's a battleground for competing visions of order, a proving ground for 21st century power politics. And how this conflict ends, whether through negotiated settlement, frozen stalemate, or prolonged war, will echo in the decisions leaders make for years to come. In 2023 and 2024, the United States under President Biden reinforced its commitment to Ukraine's defense and Euro-Atlantic integration. This culminated in the signaling of a 10-year bilateral security agreement in June 2024, aiming at enhancing Ukraine's defense capabilities and deterring future aggression. The agreement outlined plans to build and maintain Ukraine's credible defense and deterrence capability, accelerate its Euro-Atlantic integration, and consult in the event of future Russian armed attacks. However, with the return of the Trump administration in 2025, U.S. foreign policy towards Ukraine and Georgia experienced significant shifts. President Trump expressed a desire to end the war in Ukraine swiftly, though specific plans were not detailed. His administration proposed that Ukraine and Russia conduct bilateral negotiations independently, signaling a step back from direct U.S. involvement in peace talks. This approach raised concerns among European allies about Washington's commitment to Ukraine. In March 2025, following a meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky, President Trump ordered an indefinite pause on all U.S. military aid to Ukraine, citing dissatisfaction with Zelensky's commitment to peace negotiations with Russia. This decision impacted over $1 billion in arms and ammunition slated for delivery to Ukraine. Critics argued that this move weakened Ukraine's defense and emboldened Russia. Regarding NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia, the Trump administration's stance introduced further complexities. In March 2025, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte stated that Ukraine had never been promised NATO membership as part of a peace agreement and suggested that Europe and the US should eventually normalize relations with Russia after a peace agreement. This marked a departure from previous US support for Ukraine's NATO aspirations. Georgia's NATO membership prospects also faced challenges. While Georgia has been one of NATO's closest partners and aspires to join the alliance, The Trump administration's America First foreign policy and transactional relations approach suggested a cautious expansion of U.S.-Georgian relations. This ambivalence, coupled with ongoing territorial disputes and concerns about corruption, contributed to hesitancy among some NATO members regarding Georgia's membership. These policy shifts under the Trump administration have contributed to regional tensions and disputes. The U.S.'s increased military presence and support for certain governments in Ukraine have further inflamed tensions between Russia and Ukraine, as well as between the U.S. and Russia. While the conflict in Ukraine had seen periods of de-escalation, these developments highlighted the complexities and challenges in addressing the region's needs effectively. The Trump administration's national security strategy in 2017 emphasized the need for the U.S. to compete with countries like China and Russia for control of key regions, as well as resources and technologies. This strategic focus raised questions about whether the U.S. should prioritize competition with these countries or maintain global stability. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine underscores the costs and challenges of maintaining a disorderly great power system. The war in Ukraine has become a striking reminder that the competition for global influence is not a relic of the past. It is alive, evolving, and becoming more intense. Russia's annexation of Crimea and its continued support for separatists in eastern Ukraine sent a clear message. International norms and treaties are only as strong as the powers that enforce them. Moscow's willingness to use direct military force to redraw borders is not just about Ukraine. It's a broader challenge to the post-Cold War order. And this challenge has ripple effects. It emboldens other states, pressure alliances, and complicates diplomatic decision-making worldwide. The real lesson isn't just about Russia. It's about the behavior of the great powers in a world where power is once again contested. As this episode draws to a close, we're left with a paradox that sits at the heart of modern power politics. Restraint can preserve peace, but ambiguity can invite conflict. The lessons drawn from the Biden administration's Ukraine strategy and from Trump's return to unilateralism are already being applied, tested, and challenged in new arenas. These are not isolated policies. They are shaping a broader shift in how influence is asserted and alliances are negotiated. The rules of global engagement are no longer fixed. They are fluid, often reactive, and increasingly shaped by the perception of strength rather than the practice of collaboration. In Part 5 of this series, we'll shift our focus outward, moving from strategy to consequence. We'll explore what the future of power politics looks like as new flashpoints emerge across the globe. From the struggle for Ukraine's sovereignty to contested waters in the South China Sea and the fault lines of the Middle East. Next week, we'll tackle the regions where power is not just contested, it's on the brink of being redefined.